Israelite subjugation under Egyptian rule, the revelation of the Lord, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, onto Moses and subsequently Aaron, the miracles and the 10 plagues, Moses' arguments with the Pharaoh, whose unwillingness to relent invites the wrath of God. When he does relent, he later reneges on his agreements, until he breaks, overwhelmed by the miracles, and lets the Israelites out of their suffering and the Egyptian land. The face-off of 2 armies when the sea parts for the Israelites and then envelops the Egyptians. Unsurprisingly, the tale provides a rather one-sided account of the event. Have you ever reflected on what the Egyptian side of the story is, especially one that doesn't conspicuously omit the Egyptian people for just one emperor, the Pharaoh? The Egyptians and the Hebrews are 2 distinct peoples. The Old Testament also makes this distinction when it speaks of the plagues. During the 10 plagues, the Torah makes it clear that the Egyptians were affected and the Israelites stayed safe. For if you refuse to let them go and still hold them, the hand of the Lord will strike with a deadly pestilence your livestock in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing shall die of the Israelites. The God of Torah visits his fury on the Egyptians for the mistakes and shortcomings of their Pharaoh. Ancient Egypt was a very lopsided society, and the Pharaoh's authority reigned supreme over every socio-political aspect of the land, on brand for Egyptian history. The emperors and the priests were always subjecting the lower classes. The Judean God constantly claims to have hardened the heart of the Pharaoh. When God reveals himself to Moses, he tells him to resist the severe punishment of the Pharaoh. But he also says that, "I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that, when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman shall ask her neighbor and any woman living in the neighbor's house for the jewelry of silver and of gold and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and so you shall plunder the Egyptians." The word plunder may give the wrong initial impression, but the overall tone suggests that the Egyptians and Israelites lived happily among each other. Would you give your jewelry to your neighbor if they made a strongly worded request? No matter your rapport, it seems like a tall ask. But hey, that's what the Egyptian women did. They gave their jewelry to their Israelite counterparts. But when the last plague arrived and the firstborn of humans and livestock were killed, the Egyptians paid for their Pharaoh's sins despite helping the Israelites earlier. Even when the Egyptian army catches up to Moses and his followers in the wild, the parted sea returns to cover the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. Even if they were sympathetic to the Israelite cause, people who were in service to the crown were not spared. Sometimes the Egyptian populace's agreeable opinion of the Israelites is made clear. They had asked the Egyptians for the jewelry of silver and gold and clothing, and the Lord had given people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have what they asked. We can already see a visible contradiction in the depiction of the Egyptian people. The story of Exodus forms one of the fundamental pillars of the Abrahamic tradition. It is mentioned in the Torah and the New Testament. Even the Quran sticks pretty closely to the Judean version of the tale. It is a story with momentous consequences for the Semitic identity, so much so that its implications for the vast Egyptian civilization are dwarfed in comparison. The other, far more practical reason for the complete omission of the Egyptian perspective is that they were not interested in regaling tales of their setbacks. But luckily, archaeologists have discovered a few sources that shed light on the Egyptians' view of the whole incident. Before we go any further, though, it should be pointed out that while the historicity of the Torah's tale is doubted, a more grounded version of the Exodus is, by and large, supported by evidence. Egypt was one of the most prominent civilizations on Earth, and people from Western Asia migrated there, mostly during famines. Similarly, Canaanite rulers sent people to Egypt as tribute, and many historians now claim that the Egyptian Israelites were actually rural Canaanites who made their way west. Egyptians kept slaves and hired hands and relied on them for the day-to-day functioning of the economy. There is one documented incident when some workers escaped into the wilderness. Scholars believe that the story recounted in the book of Exodus was actually written in at least 4 different eras. This is true for the entirety of the Old Testament. So, over the centuries, Jewish rituals, beliefs, and ideas became embedded into the Exodus story, adorning it and giving it its unmistakable character. The saga unfolds during the Late Bronze Age, around the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. An Egyptian historian from the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Manetho, provides a rendition in his book Egyptiaca. A hefty portion of the text has since been lost to history, but thankfully several fragments have survived as quotations in Flavius Josephus's writings, a 1st century Roman Jewish historian. Like the Hebrew authors of the Old Testament, often denoted by scholars using the letters J, E, P, and D, tell a one-sided tale, the Egyptian concocts a story favorable to his compatriots. Not to mention that there are almost 8 centuries between the Exodus and Manetho's narration of it. According to him, a diviner told the Pharaoh that he would be able to see the gods if he cleansed the whole land of lepers and other polluted persons. He continues, "The king was delighted and assembled all those in Egypt whose bodies were wasted by disease. They numbered 80,000 persons. These he cast into the stone quarries to the east of the Nile, there to work segregated from the rest of the Egyptians." Here, Manetho reinforces the dichotomy of identity. The Egyptians and the Israelites are separate groups, but in this account, the Israelites have fallen from God's graces. Manetho uses the name Amenophis for the pharaoh, generally known by its more common Greek form, Amenhotep. Contemporary scholarship points to Ramses II as the most probable candidate, but there are varied opinions. Amenophis is probably a fictitious name since Manetho refuses to give the king a clear lineage, as he does with the rest of them. Meneptah is another name out in the woods because of the Meneptah stele that hints at some conquests. More on that later. A fascinating point to note is that Ramesses II was considered an Egyptian hero, hence his commonly used name, Ramesses the Great. Whoever the pharaoh was, most probably Ramesses II, Manetho claims his priest/prophet told him that he should not resort to violence against the Israelites. God shall punish him if he does, and make the Israelites rule Egypt for 13 years. When the men in the stone quarries had suffered hardships for a considerable time, they begged the king to assign to them as a dwelling place and a refuge the deserted city of the shepherds, Avaris, and he consented. And then a Messiah arose from the Hebrew ranks. Manetho initially calls him Osarsiph, after the god Osiris worshipped at Heliopolis, but when he joined this people, he changed his name and was called Moses. He enacted customs in direct conflict with Egyptian mythos and ordered them with their multitude of hands to repair the walls of the city and make ready for war against King Amenophis. They shepherds organized at Jerusalem and then set forth with an army of 200,000 men. The Pharaoh crossed the Nile with as many as 300,000 of the bravest warriors of Egypt and met the enemy. However, troubled by the thought of his priest/prophet's prediction, he decided to bail on his initial impulse. The fictitiously named Amenophis moves with his son Ramses to Ethiopia. Yeah, either it is confusing, or he is deliberately trying to confuse us with the names at this point. Another side note, Egypt underwent a major conflict with Ethiopia a century prior. Egyptian records rarely comment on it since they were almost wiped out. To get back to the subject, Manetho says that the Ethiopian king owed the pharaoh a favor, probably a post-war one, but at a later date, Amenophis advanced from Ethiopia with a large army, his son Ramses also leading a force, and that the two together joined battle with the shepherds and their polluted allies and defeated them, killing many and pursuing the others to the frontiers of Syria. Flavius obviously pokes holes in Manetho's retelling of the famous story and doesn't shy away from some zingers either. Manetho next says that, after conquering Egypt, the invaders from Jerusalem committed many heinous crimes, and for these he reproaches them, just as if he had not brought them in as enemies, or as if he was bound to accuse allies from abroad of actions which before their arrival native Egyptians were performing and had sworn to perform. But parts of the entire story do seem plausible when you start putting things together. The 10 plagues might signify some years of banishment brought about by pestilence and civil unrest. The Exodus itself might have been a retreat upon the triumphant return of the Pharaoh. Remember that Manetho stele I mentioned? That holds a very significant clue. Most of it revolves around the Egyptian conquest of the Libyans, but it ends with a telling note. The princes are prostrate, saying peace. Not one raises his head among the 9 bows. Desolation is for Chehenu. Hati is pacified. Plundered is Parcanan with every evil. Carried off is Ashkelon. Seized upon is Gaza. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waster. Its seed is no more. Karu has become a widow because of Egypt. All lands together are pacified. Everyone who was restless has been bound. Manetho was tasked with resistance that had sprung up during the eras of Rameses II and Rameses III, and, as the Steles inscriptions notify us, he did just that. However, his influence in the east did not last that long. The latest archaeological evidence shows the name of Rameses VI, but chronologies are easily muddled up. For instance, when did the Philistines make the first contact with the Israelites? But the details can just as quickly become confusing. The Roman historian Tacitus describes the Exodus in these words: "After a continuous journey for 6 days, on the 7th, they possessed themselves of a country from which they expelled the inhabitants and in which they founded a city and a temple." When you're used to hearing about 40 days and 40 nights and then the 40 years, don't 7 days feel a bit too abrupt in comparison? We hope you liked our video on the Egyptians and the Exodus. Before your timely exodus from this video, leave a like, and if you could subscribe and hit the bell, that'd be just awesome. You'll instantly be my favorite person if you do that, so please do. Let us know something new about the Egyptians during the Late Bronze Age. We love learning new things. We hope you do too, because we've got a ton of videos, and we hope to see you in the next one.